Montana Territory, 1884. The wind cut hard through the Bitterroot Valley that morning, but it was not the cold that made Rowena Clarke pull her shawl tighter. It was the weight of 5 small faces watching her with empty bowls and quieter eyes. She stood behind the clapboard church, the one her late husband helped build before the fever took him last spring. There was no dowry left, no cattle, no land, just her and the children. 5 of them, all under 12, all hers. Micah, the oldest at 11, kept his chin high even as his boots cracked open at the sole. Miriam and Maeve were twins, 8, their braids loose and lopsided, holding hands the way only sisters born minutes apart could. Miles, 6, still believed his father would come walking up the ridge one day. And little Madeline, just 4, clutched Rowena's skirt so tight her knuckles shone white. Rowena had gone to the mercantile that morning, her last jar of apple preserves in hand, hoping to trade for flour. They gave her a tin of salt and a look that said not to come back unless she had coin. She had no family left, and no man in town seemed willing to take on a woman with no dowry and 5 mouths to feed. People whispered as she passed, not cruelly, but with a kind of tired sympathy. She was only 27, still had her beauty, some said, but beauty did not fill bellies. And pride did not keep out the cold. She was walking back toward the cabin when the sound of hooves came up the trail behind her. She turned slow, squinting into the sun. The man on the horse was tall, broad-shouldered, with a trail-worn hat pulled low over his brow and dust on his boots that said he had been riding a long time. His coat was patched but clean, the rifle on his saddle polished. He rode with the ease of someone who had nothing to prove. He stopped just ahead of her and nodded once. "Ma'am." Rowena gave a polite nod back. "Sir." He dismounted, slow and careful, and removed his hat. "Name's Waylon Shepherd. I just bought the old Dunley ranch down by Cold Creek. Looking for a place to stable my horses and maybe hire some help." Rowena blinked. "I am not looking for work." He looked past her to the children in the distance, then back at her. "No, ma'am, I figured that. I was looking for a woman named Clarke, Widow Clarke." Rowena's voice tightened. "That is me." Waylon's eyes softened. "I heard what happened. I came to say I am sorry. I knew your husband years back, rode together a season when we were both younger and dumber." She tilted her head. "You knew Elijah, sure did. He told me if I ever came through this valley I should stop and say hello. I was not expecting to find this." His voice was quiet but steady. Rowena swallowed hard. "Things have not been easy. I can see that." He looked at her, really looked, not with pity, but with something steadier. "You got 5 little ones." "Yes." "You got food." "Not enough." "You got help." "No." There was a beat of silence. Then he said it clear as day, like it had been waiting in his chest all along. "You may not have a dowry, Widow Clarke, but I have got enough for all of you." Rowena stared at him like he had spoken in a foreign tongue. He lifted his hat, ran a hand through his dark hair. "I am not asking for anything right now. I just want to help. I have got land, cattle, and coin. I can bring you supplies. Firewood. Whatever you need." She folded her arms. "And why would you do that?" "Because I remember what it is like to be alone. And because I promised Elijah I would look in on his family one day. I am keeping my word." Rowena shook her head. "People do not help without wanting something." "I do." He did not push. Just looked at her like he meant every word. By the time he left, he had promised to return the next day with flour, beans, and a sack of potatoes. And true to his word, he did. Waylon kept coming back. Not just with food, but with mended boots for Micah, a doll for Madeline. He fixed the broken hinge on the cabin door, chopped wood without being asked. He never stayed long, just long enough to make sure they were warm and fed. The children began to wait for his visits like they were holidays. Micah followed him around, asking about horses. Miriam and Maeve braided his horse's mane. Miles drew him pictures in the dirt with a stick, and Madeline had started calling him Mr. Shepherd in her tiny voice. Rowena tried to keep her guard up. But it was hard when a man showed up every day without fail, when he repaired things without talking about it, when he listened more than he spoke. One night, after he had carried a sack of grain inside and she had thanked him for the 10th time, he turned to go, but paused. "You do not have to do this alone, Rowena." She felt her chest tighten at the sound of her name in his voice. "I am not looking to replace Elijah," he said, "but I would be proud to stand beside what he built." She stared at him, unsure what to say. "You think on it," he said gently. "I will keep showing up either way." He tipped his hat and walked into the dark. That night, while the children slept, Rowena sat at the table staring at the worn wood, her hands still. There was something about Waylon that steadied her. He did not make promises he could not keep. He came when he said he would, and he looked at her like she was not broken, just tired. She did not know what to call what was growing between them, but it felt like hope. And after a year of only surviving, that was more than enough. The first snow came early that year, quiet and deep. It blanketed the valley in a stillness that seemed to hush even the wind. Rowena stood at the window, her needle paused midway through a stitch, watching Waylon's wagon ease up the ridge. She hadn't asked him to come. He never asked if he could. He just arrived when the road allowed it, always with something useful, never with fanfare. Inside the cabin, the air was sharp with pine sap and the lingering smell of boiled cabbage. Micah was trying to teach Miles how to whittle without drawing blood, while Maeve and Miriam sat cross-legged by the hearth, stringing dried apple slices onto twine. Madeline had fallen asleep curled against the dog. Waylon had brought the week before a quiet, gray-bellied thing that took to the children like kin. Rowena set her mending aside and opened the door as Waylon stepped down from the wagon. He carried a length of canvas and a bundle of cured hides over his shoulder. "Didn't figure you'd have much to patch the roof with," he said, brushing snow off his coat. She stepped aside so he could enter. "I told Micah I'd find something come spring. You'd be snow-soaked by then." He set the canvas near the hearth and crouched to let the heat reach his hands. Rowena watched him for a moment before speaking. "You've done more than most men would." "I'm not most men," he said, matter of fact, not proud. She leaned against the table, arms folded. "You ever think about what people say about you coming up here so often?" "They've got mouths," he said. "I've got ears. Doesn't mean I listen." She gave a quiet laugh, the kind that didn't rise past her throat. "You're a strange man, Waylon Shepherd." He looked up at her, and there was something in his eyes, something settled. "I've been called worse." Later, when the children were asleep and the fire was low, Waylon laid out the hides on the table. He handled them with care, showing her how to sew them into foot traps and mittens. "You trap these yourself?" she asked, threading a bone needle. "Traded for him," he said. "Old Blackfoot man west of here. Said he'd rather trade with someone who knew how to be quiet than someone who only knew how to talk." Rowena looked over the edge of the hide at him. "You always been alone?" He didn't answer right away, just worked the palm of his hand over a seam. "Had a brother once. Younger, didn't make it through the war. I'm sorry." He nodded once, not to dismiss it, but to say he'd heard her. "After he died, I left Missouri. Figured I'd rather be somewhere empty than somewhere full of ghosts." Rowena ran her thumb along the stitch she'd just finished. "This place has its own ghosts." "Sure," he said. "But not all ghosts are bad company." They worked beside each other in silence a while, the fire popping low behind them. Outside, the snow had thickened, pressing the world into quiet. When she stood to stretch, he rose with her slowly. His gaze lingered, not on her face but on her hands chapped and raw from wood and water and cold. You need time, Rowena. I know that. She met his eyes, steady now. There was no fear in her voice. And if I don't take too long, then I'll be here when you're ready. He left just before dawn, the sky still dark, but light edging the horizon like a promise. She watched him go, the wagon creaking over snow-packed ground, and something unfamiliar stirred in her chest, not urgency, not longing, but the early shape of trust. She turned back into the cabin, where the children were beginning to stir, where the fire needed feeding and the work of the day waited. She didn't smile, but her shoulders sat easier and her breath didn't catch the way it used to. She had no dowry, no land of her own. But someone had said he had enough for all of them. And more than that, he kept showing up. That, she was beginning to believe, might be worth more than anything else. By late January, the snow had deepened to the height of a wagon wheel, and the path to Cold Creek disappeared beneath a white crust that cracked underfoot. The cabin walls groaned in the wind at night, but inside, the fire stayed lit, and the children slept warm beneath quilts layered thick with wool and old shirts Waylon had bartered for at a settler's barn 3 ridges over. He came twice a week now, staying longer each time. Not lingering, not pressing, just present. He worked with Micah to reinforce the lean-to shelter for the goats, helped Miriam and Maeve string snares near the tree line, and showed Miles how to oil the hinges on the door so it wouldn't stick when the cold swelled the wood. Madeline had taken to riding in the crook of his arm like it was her rightful place, and he let her, quiet and content. One morning, Waylon arrived with a sack slung over his shoulder and a coat draped across his saddle. It was a woman's coat, worn but sturdy, shearling-lined, the stitching careful and tight. He held it out to Rowena without explanation. She looked at it, then at him. "You find that in a trade," he nodded. "Widow north of the ridge had it tucked away. Said it was her daughter's before she married and moved back east." Rowena let her hands run over the lining, her fingers catching the nap of the wool. "I've managed with shawls. I know, but you shouldn't have to." She didn't answer, only carried it inside and hung it by the door. When she came back out, he was checking the straps on his saddle. "You always pass through alone?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "You never thought about settling before?" He tightened the cinch on his horse and looked up. "I did, once. Years back." "What happened?" "I wasn't the kind of man she could wait for," he said simply. Rowena leaned against the porch post, arms crossed over her apron. "You were away." "I was angry. After the war, I carried it with me. Thought distance might keep it from spilling over. Turns out distance just makes it quieter, doesn't kill it." She studied his face. The lines around his eyes weren't from smiling, they were the kind carved by sun and silence. "You still carry it?" she asked. Waylon didn't blink. "Not like I did. Working land helps." "So does knowing someone's expecting you." The wind lifted a curl from her temple. She tucked it back slowly. "You mean the children?" He met her eyes. "I mean you." Neither of them looked away. The cold bit at their skin, but neither moved. That evening, after supper, Micah asked if he could ride out with Waylon next time he headed toward the creek. Waylon agreed, but only if Micah could saddle the horse himself and rise before the sun. Micah nodded solemnly, the way boys do when they've just been handed a task that feels like a door opening. By the hearth, Rowena watched the boy sit straighter. She glanced at Waylon, who was coaxing the twins through their letters with patience she hadn't seen in a man since Elijah. After the children were put down, she poured 2 tin cups of chicory. She handed one to Waylon and sat beside him at the table, her voice low. "You're changing things here." He didn't speak right away. "Is that all right?" She looked toward the small bedroom where the children lay huddled together. "I think it's more than all right." He sipped the chicory, eyes on the fire. "You said once that people don't help without wanting something." She nodded. I remember. I've been thinking on that. She waited. I don't want anything from you, he said. But I want things with you. Her breath caught, not from surprise, but from the steadiness of it. He wasn't asking, he wasn't pressing, just offering. I'm still grieving, she said. I know, I'm not asking you to stop. But you're asking for space beside it. He looked down at his hands. I'm asking if there might come a day when I'm not just helping. She sat quiet, the fire casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, the snow had stilled again, the world hushed. She reached for his hand not with urgency but with certainty and rested her fingers against his. There might come a day, she said. Waylon didn't move, didn't speak. He just turned her hand over in his and held it there as if he'd known all along that this moment would come, quiet as snow falling in the dark. And in that silence, something shifted. Not the weight of grief, but the balance of it. She didn't feel alone in the carrying anymore. The thaw came slow, loosening the ground in patches, turning snowbanks to grit and slush. By March, the valley held the scent of wet bark and thawed earth, the kind of smell that made a person believe in starting over. Rowena stood behind the cabin, sleeves rolled, turning soil by hand where the sun had touched longest. She wasn't planting yet, just testing the ground, feeling how deep the freeze still sat. Waylon leaned against the fence he'd helped mend 2 weeks prior, watching her work without stepping in. You ever grow tobacco? She asked, not looking up from the dirt. Couple years back near Helena, he said. Hard to get it to cure right in the cold. You thinking of planting? No, she said. Just remembering my father's hands. He used to rub a leaf between his fingers to see how it'd dry. Waylon nodded. You got his hands, not near as steady. She drew her fingertips through the soil, then wiped them against her skirt. You know what this land could be with the right care? I've got a guess, he said. She stood, brushing her palms together. It'd take more than one set of hands. His eyes didn't shift off her. I've still got mine. She met his gaze, the line of her mouth unreadable. You always speak that plain, he tilted his head, not quite a shrug. You ever known me not to? She didn't smile, but the corners of her eyes changed. No, I haven't. Later that week, they went to the Dunley place together. Waylon had asked if she wanted to see it, and she'd said yes without weighing the words. Micah stayed behind, watching the younger ones with the same measured seriousness he used when boiling oats or sharpening the kitchen knife. The land stretched broader than she expected, low hills, 2 pastures, a half-finished barn with good beams and missing planks. There was a stream cutting through the lower edge, clear and steady, bordered with alder. Waylon led her inside the house, which had been stripped back to its bones. No furniture, just the frame of a hearth and sunlight angling through the window slats. It's not much yet, he said. She walked the room slowly. It's honest. I figured I'd build it proper this spring, start with the roof, then put in a stove, maybe a smokehouse after that. Her hand brushed along the window frame. You planning it for yourself? I was. He stepped beside her, not crowding. But I've started thinking different. She turned, the light behind her, eyes steady. You asking me to marry you? No, he said. Not yet. I'm asking if you can see a place for yourself here. She looked out the window, down toward the creek. I can see it. He didn't move, just waited. Then she said, but I won't leave the cabin until the season turns. That land still holds my husband's bones. And I wouldn't ask you to, he said. They didn't speak on the ride back, but it wasn't silence heavy with things unsaid. It was quiet like the long breath between one chapter and the next. That night, she laid out the seed catalog she'd kept folded in the cookstove drawer since autumn. She set it on the table, flattening the creases, and began circling names in pencil: beans, onions, squash, barley. When Waylon came the next morning, she slid the page across the table without a word. He looked at it, then at her. "You ready?" he asked. "I am." He folded the paper, tucked it into the inside of his coat. "Then I'll see what I can bring back." As he reached the door, she spoke again. "Waylon." He paused. She stepped forward close enough that the scent of wood smoke from his coat reached her. She lifted her palm to his jaw, rough with the start of a beard. Her thumb rested just beneath his ear. "You've been patient," she said. "That's not small." His voice came quiet. "I'd wait another year if you asked." She drew back just enough to meet his eyes. "You won't have to." He left with the list in his coat and something lighter in his step, though he didn't show it. Back inside, Rowena turned to the children, already gathering their boots and gloves. She handed Micah a bucket and told him to check the hens. The girls were sent to gather kindling, Miles to watch the pot on the stove. They moved without complaint, not because she raised them hard, but because they understood now that something steady had begun to take root in their lives. Not luck, not charity, something chosen. And though the cold hadn't fully let go, the days were longer now. The light stayed past supper and the world outside had begun to stir again. So had she. By May, the thaw had given way to soft winds and the steady green of new growth. The trees along the creek swelled with leaf and shadow, and the soil warmed under Rowena's hands as she planted the first rose barley by the fence, squash nearer the cabin. The children worked without asking. They had fallen into a rhythm that came not from instruction, but from watching how Waylon turned earth without waste, how Rowena bent to her work with care instead of desperation. That morning, Waylon arrived with a crate of seed potatoes and a pair of hens tucked into a slatted cage. He set them down in the yard, then straightened, brushing dust from his sleeves. "I saw the preacher in town," he said, voice low. "He asked after you." Rowena pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the morning was warm. "What did you say?" "I said you were well. That you were planting, that you had people looking out for you." She looked over at him, shading her eyes against the sun. "You didn't say more." He shook his head, slow and certain. "Not my place to speak on what hasn't been spoken between us." She watched him a long moment, then nodded and returned to her planting. He knelt beside her, sleeves rolled, and began placing seed potatoes into the furrows she'd already carved. They worked without words for a time, the soil rich between their fingers, the air carrying the scent of lilac from a bush that had grown wild along the fence line. When the last of the seed was covered, Waylon sat back on his heels. "I've been thinking about the house," he said. "I'd like to finish the roof before the summer storms start, but I won't do it unless you say I should." Rowena brushed dirt from her palms. "Why wouldn't you?" "Because I won't build a home for someone who's unsure. I want to build it with her." She stood slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. "You'll need help with the rafters." "I will." She looked down at him, then toward the cabin where the children's voices floated from the open window. "If I say yes, it won't be for the sake of shelter. I wouldn't want it to be." "I'm not uncertain," she said. "I'm just careful." Waylon rose to his feet, the morning light catching the line of his jaw. Dust settled in the creases of his shirt. "I'd rather walk slow with you than rush with someone else." She stepped closer, close enough to see the faint scar near his collarbone, the one he never spoke of. "Then walk with me. Not behind, not ahead. Beside." He reached for her hand, not grasping, just opening his palm. She slid hers into it and held fast. Later that week, Micah rode with Waylon to the Dunley place, and they brought back lumber and nails, a hand-cranked auger, and a sack of nails tied with twine. The roof went up in pieces, each beam set with quiet strength. Rowena came with meals wrapped in cloth and stayed to help lift boards, measure spacing, check for gaps where wind might sneak through come autumn. When the roof was finished, Waylon sanded the entry threshold smooth and hung a door that didn't creak. He carved a beam over the hearth and burned a mark into it, a simple shape, like clasped hands. In June, under a sky the color of washed linen, they stood before the preacher in the same church where Elijah had been buried. Rowena wore her best dress, the hem let out by Miriam so it reached her ankles again. Waylon wore a clean shirt and the same boots he'd first arrived in. The children stood around them, quiet and whole. Madeline held Rowena's hand. Micah handed Waylon a ring of braided wire, nothing store-bought, but strong and sure. When the preacher asked if she would take this man, Rowena answered without pause, "I will." When Waylon was asked the same, he lifted her hand and kissed her knuckles before saying, "Every day." They returned to the cabin for supper, and Rowena cooked with Miriam and Maeve while Waylon and Micah built a fire behind the house. There were no guests save the preacher, who stayed long enough for stew and cornbread before tipping his hat and riding north before dusk. That night, once the children had fallen asleep in the loft, Rowena and Waylon walked the ridge above the cabin. The stars were out, quiet and high, and the air smelled of pine and warm dirt. "You ever think we'd get here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hoped," he said. "Didn't expect, but I hoped." She leaned into his side and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders, slow and careful. They stood that way a long time, watching the lantern glow through the cabin window, the wind moving soft through the grass. In the months that followed, the land bloomed. The barley rose tall and gold, and the squash vines curled thick around the cabin's edge. The hens laid steady, and the children grew sun-browned and strong. Micah rode to town once a week to trade, always returning with something small, a spool of thread, a pencil stub, a handful of nails. Waylon finished the house before the first frost. He built a bed frame from pine, and Rowena sewed curtains from flour sacks and hand-me-down cloth. The children helped move what little they had, and the old cabin was left behind, not abandoned but honored. On the first night in their new home, Waylon lit the stove while Rowena settled the children into their new sleeping loft. When she came down, he was sitting at the table, a candle between them, his hand resting on an open palm. "Tell me something," he said. She sat across from him, her fingers brushing his. "What do you want to know? Anything?" She looked around the smooth walls, the fresh swept floor, the firelight dancing on the beams they had raised together. She looked at him, steady and familiar, and she smiled. "This is the first place I've ever planted something and felt certain it would grow." Waylon reached across the table and took her hand into both of his. "Then we'll keep planting," he said. "Whatever we need, together." And they did. Years passed and the land held them well. The children grew into their own lives. Micah stayed on, building a barn with his own hands. The girls married local boys who respected quiet and work. Miles became a teacher, Madeline, a midwife. Rowena and Waylon aged slow and steady, their days marked by harvests and winters, by letters from far-off places, by hands held across the table each night before supper. Their love was not loud, not made of declarations or grand shows. It was built in the folds of daily life, in shared labor, in laughter at dusk, in the feel of someone's presence at your back when chopping wood or hauling water. And in all their years together, neither ever wanted for more than what they had, because what they had was enough, earned, steady, and true.